We're going to get started with our first NNIP showcase. I hope you all enjoyed lunch. So just a refresh of what this is, it'll happen Thursday and Friday as well. So they're 5-minute rapid presentations where we're going to hear from partners about what they're working on, and the slides will auto advance, so they'll be on their toes. And today we have Kelly Davila from DataHaven in New Haven, Steve Saylor and Bob Gradeck from Pittsburgh, Tommy Pearce from Atlanta, and then Donovan Harvey from DC. So we'll get started with Kelly. Thank you all.
All right. Okay, cool. Well, I'm really glad to see everybody again after years and years away from each other. I'm going to present a little bit on a report that we wrote for the Connecticut Office of Rural Health. They primarily help rural communities with applying for grant funding for different health-related endeavors. So this is an update to a report that was previously done for them in 2015 by another contractor. The first kind of challenge we had to do in here was defining what rural towns were. Every state has their own definition, and the federal government has their own definition. With CTORH, we decided to combine the state's definition with HRSA's definition for grant funding purposes. So that led us to 77 rural towns out of the 169 in Connecticut. So the 2015 report used geographical aggregation in order to make some statements about rural towns in Connecticut. We decided this time that we wanted to move away from that because regional groupings can sometimes mask disparities. These are two examples that would be in one region, but that are two different towns. So we used a demographically informed approach and landed on 3 rural cluster types. These are, we workshopped some names, but none of them stuck. So unfortunately, you have to remember these. Type 1 towns have more adults with less than high school or less education. Type 2 towns have higher shares of seniors. Type 3 towns are very, very high income. Many cases that in Connecticut, that's due to zoning. You have like 2-acre lot sizes. They're rural by default. Before going into differences between these clusters, just some challenges that each rural town tends to face. The first of which is just big distance drive times to different facilities. This is particularly problematic in some of the type 2 towns where it can be about a half-hour drive or more to the nearest facility, especially for specialized care. Also, hospital closures and consolidations. I'm sure that a lot of you in your states are experiencing this too. In Connecticut, only 4 hospitals are left serving rural areas. There are 20 more statewide, but the rural counties are only served by 4 hospitals. They tend to close duplicative services, and this especially hits rural communities hard in terms of labor and delivery units. And then finally, just workforce shortages in general. Connecticut graduates a bunch of nurses, but most of them leave the state. So there's a projection that we're going to be short not only licensed nurse practitioners, but also home health aides, especially in the towns with more seniors. That's going to be a big challenge in the next few years. So going into the specific demographics of each of these cluster types, type 1 towns, again, these are the ones with more adults with high school or less education. Typically more racial diverse than the other rural towns, but not necessarily as much as the state itself. That's kind of important going forward. These towns have a higher percentage of Black, Latino, and Native American adults. So when we look at just overall cluster types in total without disaggregating by race and ethnicity or any other demographics, we tend to see things in terms of different social determinants that look very similar to the statewide averages. But in the event that we can disaggregate, for example, in type 1 towns which have enough of a population but that we can disaggregate by race and ethnicity, we do see that it's pretty clear that Black, Latino, and Native American adults have higher rates of financial, food, and housing insecurity than white adults. And in this case, the white adults are actually doing better in type 1 towns than they are statewide. I have time. So health disparities are really apparent by clusters. We're looking at here, this chart is the number of adults who have delayed or skipped medical care altogether. We run a survey statewide, so we have some samples of this data that we're able to aggregate and look at these by the town level. And so adults in type 1 towns are much, much, much more likely to have delayed medical care. It's also important to note that those are HIPSA workforce shortage areas, especially in type 1 towns. So when we kind of look at the health outcomes of these communities, we know that type 1 towns have adults who have elevated rates of diagnosed depression, poor mental health. They also report more binge drinking and smoking, and they have much higher ER encounter rates than the other rural towns or the state as a whole. Handful of things too about environmental issues. Rural towns typically have pretty good access to the outdoors. Unfortunately, this means that there's much higher rates of diagnosed Lyme disease in these towns, which is only going to get worse as climate change warms up New England. Ooh, more time. Sorry. And a lot of this just results in disparate mortality across these cluster types. So type 1 towns have higher rates of premature mortality across different clinical features, and especially related to lung cancer and overdose. Overdose is becoming a problem in both rural and urban counties or areas in Connecticut, mostly due to the presence of fentanyl in the drug supply. And so what this ends up being, attributing to is the overall years of potential life lost before age 75 is much higher in type 1 towns than statewide or in the other rural towns in Connecticut. So CTRH is going to use this information to advocate for policies that, on the one hand, can help preserve healthcare workforce and healthcare facilities in rural areas. Well, thank you.
Before we get our presentation started, have a couple of announcements. First is the Legos that you saw on the table. Kathy provided them. And I think like what would be a fun activity is if there's something that inspired you today or here at NNIP, make a little data sculpture, fill out a card and put it on the savings shelf. So this example I have here is like I was inspired by Denise's talk this morning about how she's trying to build bridges from the federal government to us practitioners. So give it a look, make your sculpture. And then the second piece is, I'm not going to hold this upside down. We brought Civic Switchboard reports with us from Pittsburgh. Please take them. We don't want to drag them back. James Neal, IMLS, was our program officer on this. And it's all about how to equip libraries to be civic data intermediaries like ourselves. So thank you. You ready to go? So this is Steve. And do we start it here?
Yeah.
Oh, click the button. That makes sense. I was like looking for a keyboard. Here we go. So we're going to talk about HouseCat. It's the Affordable Housing Information Catalog that we developed in Pittsburgh recently, and everybody loves pictures of cats. And so we're going to talk all about that today, the process. We're going to close with lessons for you. So we're really excited to share that. So our community, like many of your communities, was not proactive in responding to threats to housing affordability. Those threats come on subsidized dwellings through expiration of subsidies, but also condition issues where HUD pulled subsidies from a number of properties in Pittsburgh, 140. So in the period of a couple of years, units were lost. And so the Urban Redevelopment Authority made efforts to actually start to track this in a very manual way. They did a lot of really good work, but it was a guy in an office who was not an information systems person pulling this stuff out of HUD's databases and compiling it into a PDF report. So it was great. It was really valuable information. It was very labor intensive. But so we decided to create HouseCat to kind of address this and make it so that this data could be more actionable. So you can see this cat has lasers coming out of its eyes. The database is on fire and it's only getting worse here. So we better call the fire department. And this is where our project comes in. This is you?
Yeah, so then we start, so we'll see a little bit of HouseCat here. And you can see what we did is we took a whole bunch of different publicly available
Steve, we need you at the mic.
Housing data from the HUD. And thanks, Bob, for and pointing over there, the jump to data set. You can see all the different data sets that we've collected on the right, Bob. There. Thank you. Yes, so we have a whole bunch. We have a bunch of HUD and local, or Pennsylvania Commonwealth federal, or affordable housing data sets. We also have these filters on the left, and this is thanks to designer Carl De Silva in Atlanta, was down in Atlanta time, helped us design this and work on pretty much minimal filters to try and make it so it's not super complicated. A whole bunch of data work, which just kind of gets you to where you're looking for. We also tied it together with an indicators platform that we're working on that takes a lot of the data that we store on the data center, as well as pulling in a whole bunch of ACS and census data, and just joining it and setting it to our different geographies so you can click through. And so if you might find like where a bunch of housing, affordable housing is, you can check and see what's up with the neighborhood. And so we also got a lot of inspiration from from folks in New York and DC. Shout out.
Yeah, Peter, thank you.
And so these two of big influences when we were going through our design process and trying to see what people used and worked and what we should do.
And the thing I'm going to talk about from here on out, and Steve too, you really need a strategy for achieving outcomes you want to see. And we're going to talk about some of the processes that we use. Or else it's just a data tool that nobody uses. Like, we can build great data tools in this room, but if we don't think about the strategy for actually translating that to action, we're doing our communities a disservice or missing opportunities. And so I would say, like, the quote I would come up with here as I prepared for this, if your logic model is based on hope, like I hope somebody's going to use this tool, then you're a dope. So you may think your logic model is really great and pretty, but in essence, it looks like the thing on the right where Patrick Starr is trying to build a logic model. And if you don't think about how this is going to get used, you're doing your community a disservice, like I said. So we invested time in building relationships all across the ecosystem, talking to people, learning about their needs and contexts.
And so that's how we kind of came up with the key filters. So not just like the topic levels there, but the actual individual options within those filters was a big dive with a lot of the folks working in the preservation community, which is also a big shout out and thanks to our friends in the Create Lab at CMU, who connected us a lot with the preservation housing community. So the data pipelines are the big investment. Working with all of that disparate data was a mess, to say the least. Was a lot of work, and making sure that it's automated and can process and be on the website was huge. So yeah, we went with a co-ownership model where the community co-owns it through a housing preservation data working group, along with, managed by a local nonprofit, and then, yeah.
And so we built new spaces for housing data conversations. We put data on every meeting agenda. We talk about data all the time, so it's really nice to foreground this and use the tool along with those meetings. And we also build capacity to meet the preservation community's data needs. We do student projects. We've organized a housing data working group as well, where people could drop in and learn more. So I would invite you to apply for access. We, in this co-ownership model, don't approve access, but the terms of use we built with our community partners are there. We'd invite you to apply. You can check it out and see how, like, having real-time data, it really can make a difference with housing preservation. So thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to put this on the saving shelf. So when you make your sculpture, put it on the saving shelf. Here I go.
Good afternoon. I'm Tommy Pearce from Neighborhood Nexus in Atlanta, Georgia. I recently found out that if you last-minute bail on a virtual showcase, they'll make you come do it in person with a 20-second timer, which I'm from Georgia, so I don't talk super fast, but I'll try. All right, let's do it. Something that I've been thinking about a lot and spending a lot of time on is not just making data accessible like we've done for the last 13 years at Neighborhood Nexus, but and I guess also not making it just actionable, but we need to make it engaging. A lot of our audience are nonprofit professionals, social workers like myself, who, if they're on our website, it's probably because their boss told them to, or they're trying to impress their board. And so we focused a lot on how do we make our brand more engaging and welcoming to non-data people. So you can see we moved recently from this ninja star of an icon we've had for over a decade to a pleasant, friendly, welcoming pinwheel. We spent a whole lot of money on that, and then found a guy in Fiverr to animate it. So our mission is growing a culture of data-informed decision-making across Georgia's social impact sector. We very often focus on the data-informed impact, or data-informed sector, but really trying to focus now on how do you actually grow the culture, which is a little bit different of a thing. And so to do that, we have a theory of change, which we back our way into the sector change by making sure that lots of organizations are using data well. But to do that, we have to prepare and make sure that individuals and the professionals and the community members that are actually doing the work within an organization are doing this right. And so we're really thinking about individuals with Nikolai, who does our community engagement work and training, and thinking, we had consultants walk us through, before the logo, thinking about a marketing strategy and understanding our audiences. And we I obviously can't read all of this in 20 seconds, but came up with 3 buckets, right? So your leaders and high-level decision makers, the worker bees, and then finally the sort of researchers, right? So researchers tend to be more transactional, whereas the leaders are like, just tell me something because I'm about to say something publicly and I want you to be liable for it. And so we spent a lot of time thinking through not just what the services are, but how it makes these audiences feel, which I thought was really important, especially as we message data and brand it in a way that people will use it or want to use it. What we came up with was this brand promise of we work the data so you can work, so the data can work for you and for the community. What I love was kind of the personality that we tried to share in our reports and social media and even in person in meetings. So friendly without being overeager, smart but not intimidating, creative but not chaotic, working on that one. There's a lot of, we have a whole thing. This is the reduction of it, but it's still a lot. But it kind of breaks down all of our values and our personality into something that is a little more approachable to the general audience, because we really just need people to think about data and not be super intimidated. There's not a lot of magic. They kind of take the magic out of it. It included brand guidelines where we're really motivated, or, we really like the Urban Institute's data visualization guidelines, but you think about The Economist and Bloomberg, and people recognize that. And if we can have a locally recognized and sort of trusted, friendly brand, we think that a lot of people will use it more. They'll start to get that recognition and everything. And so we have this whole data visualization and brand guide that we developed because we think a lot about kind of, like I said, not just the data side, but the business side and how we grow our own organization. And so as through the pandemic, we positioned ourselves as data thought leaders in the sector, we wanted to have that sort of professional, but still very approachable aesthetic. And so if you follow us on, Twitter or LinkedIn and other future things as we increase our channels, we try to have a level of consistency also that isn't chaotic and have 30 different colors in every chart like we have done for the last 13 years. So we're just trying to be a lot more intentional about all of this. And like I said, we spent a lot of money, so we're gonna show it again. But one tip is if you're thinking about going through a brand refresh or anything like that, ahead of time, get a marketing professional or someone on your board. I got an executive from a digital marketing firm to join our board, and also a marketing and business instructor from Emory University. And then 6 months later, made the ask of what kind of discount can you give us? And so that's my trick to make it happen. But the consulting, not just the logo, was really important to think through our audiences. Thanks.
I'll take my time. Give me a second. Give me a second. Good afternoon, everybody. Come on. It was a 14-hour drive from Chicago for my first NNIP. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. My name is Donovan Harvey. I'm a research analyst with Urban Greater DC, and today I'm going to give you a little tour, a little welcome to Washington, DC, and we'll take a tour along the Green Line. So, as Kathy mentioned at the opening of the meeting, DC is a lot more than just the nation's capital. In fact, as the principal city in one of the most diverse metropolitan areas in the country, it's a cultural hotbed. So we talked a little bit about DC being the birthplace of go-go music, but it also has a deeply influential punk scene and, to complement its music scene, one of the most diverse culinary traditions in the United States, with a heavily immigrant-inspired culinary tradition, with most notably the half-smoke, half-pork, half-beef. You can get it at Ben's Chili Bowl. However, the diversity that has undergirded DC's cultural production is increasingly under threat. Since 1970, DC has lost over 200,000 Black residents. And with that and other challenges, Urban Greater DC was formed with a charge to use data to inform the efforts of decision makers to solve our region's most pressing challenges. And we have here some of the core members of our team. However, there are many members left off that slide, and all of them are responsible for the work we do here at Urban Greater DC. Some of the examples of our work are pictured above, including facilitating data sharing, such as the DC Preservation Network, very similar to HouseCat, and through research publications, with the most recent example being an assessment of the impact of affordable housing on nearby property values in Alexandria, Virginia. But we were promised a tour, so let's get it started. We're going to begin our little tour at 500 LaFont Plaza, which is where we are. We're then going to go across the street to the wharf before hopping on the Green Line to the neighborhoods of Columbia Heights and Mount Pleasant. So we'll begin with where we are, and we'll start from the roof. Now I'm going to let it wait just for a second so you all can get the view, which of course you'll have to wait until the reception to get. So what we're going to talk about first is if you look north from the rooftop, hold on till 5, you'll see Independence Avenue and the Smithsonian Complex. If you have time, I highly recommend the Hirshhorn Museum and National Galleries of African and Asian Art. But if you look to the south, you'll find across I-395 the wharf. The multi-billion-dollar redevelopment, which anchors the southwest waterfront neighborhood in DC, is the site of our first neighborhood tour, which we'll have on Thursday. And it includes cultural institutions, the single oldest continually operating open-air fish market in the United States, which opened in 1805. But you'll note multi-billion-dollar redevelopment means you might ask what was there before. And pictured on this slide is Captain White's fish barge, which formerly an anchor of the old wharf neighborhood. Its loss symbolizes some of the transition in that wharf neighborhood. But now what we're going to do is hop on the Green Line and go to Columbia Heights, getting off of the metro and entering the Columbia Heights neighborhood, which is bordered to the west by Mount Pleasant. The two neighborhoods are a microcosm both of DC's area's diversity, but also challenges related to housing preservation and housing affordability. So when I talked about a little bit of the diversity of those two neighborhoods, Columbia Heights is a historically Black neighborhood. It's been since the integration of DC in the 60s. Mount Pleasant, also historically Black, was also a core component of DC's Latin Quarter, which had that title in the 70s and 80s. However, the two neighborhoods experienced significant underinvestment in the post-integration era, which then prompted a significant redevelopment effort in the 1990s. And you'll note that significant redevelopment effort induced very significant neighborhood changes. Specifically, the percentage Black non-Hispanic fell from 66% in 1990 to less than 35% by 2010. And as we move forward, these slides are jumping, credit to them. But of course, people didn't go quietly into that good night. And both Columbia Heights and Mount Pleasant have been held up as successful efforts to resist gentrification. Specifically, using tools like the DC Preservation Network, local housing activists were able to successfully preserve 2,200 units of affordable housing, including 400 units purchased using DC's Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and the DC Housing Preservation Trust Fund. However, while there were successful efforts to maintain the active local networks of folks, they are also symbolic of cultural equity challenges, which we're going to talk about in today's local session panel at the end of the day. And with that, I'll pass it over to them. Thank you.
Doing questions for just 5 minutes, and Sonia and Kathy will hand you the microphone. So does anyone have a question or two for our panelists? Thank you all.
Don't be shy. I have a quick one for Tommy, and this is selfish. Did you guys think about changing your name? We get that question about NNIP all the time.
It's been suggested to us about changing our name because it doesn't say Atlanta or Data. But I think where we were at in 2020, just kind of picking up the brand recognition, I think we just didn't want to make that big of a move yet.
This is for the Connecticut presentation. For the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 cities, maybe I just missed it when you were doing the definitions of there. Can we say that those are like more or less urban or more or less rural for the tiers? How do we think about those tiers?
They're all rural, so there's two definitions. Connecticut Office of Rural Health uses a threshold of no population greater than 10,000 people and a population density of 500 people or less. But in those type 3 towns, a lot of those are really wealthy suburban areas outside of cities like New Haven or Bridgeport. So they're kind of rural by default. That's what I was kind of getting at. Like, these are places where they might have a minimum lot size of like 2 acres, but they're right outside of New Haven. So they're technically rural, but not really.
Hi, I'm Rania from Oakland, California, and I have a question to Tommy. So after rebranding, did you do any study or analysis of how that branding impacted how the community perceived or interpreted data after the rebranding, or it just looks better?
I would say our biggest audience is not the community itself, but
Whoever the audience is,
sector
the
leaders.
community is the
Yeah, we've
audience.
gotten a lot of organizations ask, who did you use? Like, we did a pretty intentional rollout of it, talking about how it's driven by mission. It wasn't just to make it prettier. Like, before I worked at Neighborhood Nexus, when I just used the tools, I hated the logo, but that it wasn't, it was only partially personal. It really has increased people like, we do a lot of consulting to earn revenue, and I think people increasingly want our logo on their tools, and it's without it being a little ninja star thing. And so there is like a kind of a cool factor, I guess, but that's with any brand. I'll say one thing on the name change that Kathy, we do want to change our Twitter handle, which is NH Nexus, which looks like New Hampshire. So that's one thing we got to figure out.
And Rania did a good modeling of your name and city when you ask a question.
My name's Alyssa. I'm from Boston, from MAPC. This is a question for the House Cat team. I was wondering if you could just speak to your process of building this platform. Like, did you use a particular software, or was it kind of built from scratch?
Thank you for the question. So this is a question best for Steve. So he could talk about the pipelines and also the interface.
Yes, so the pipelines are just our own bespoke Python scripts that collect a lot of that. And that should all be open source on our GitHub repo. And then the tool itself, the backend is Django, which is this Python like web backend application. And then on the front, it's homemade, written in JavaScript, TypeScript, React.
And I would say like the major work on this tool was actually trying to figure out what the hell we were dealing with in terms of HUD data, and figuring out like all the different places that it went with very little documentation and bringing it together. So it looks really good. We have it built in so that there's like a really nice, like we can get real-time data on when something flips from, when the newest inspection scores come in, for example. We don't have to wait 4 months, but it was a lot of work and a lot of trial and error, and it's really fortunate that we had the team that we have to be able to pull that together. So feel free to ask us questions after. You can definitely benefit from the code that we've written for that.
And it's all on GitHub, so WPRDC.
Hi, first, thank you for those presentations. Love them all. The question is for Tommy for, rebranding. We're from the team is from Milwaukee, and we just had like Data Day event where we talked a little bit about transformation, right? And going from transactional, the difference between transactional and transformation. So my question around that I have for you is, you went through like a rebranding, a lot of like things looks wise, right? What are some things that you all did, to also like adjust your practices or how you're engaging with people? Because I do think that's also part of the rebranding, and that's like the heart of the work. And if you haven't, like, what do you hope that your organization does to get to a point where it's, the rebranding is also like the internal part of the work?
Yeah, I think the connection there is that both our brand and our programs and everything are driven by the same values and the same mission. And so we've added programming around community engagement that Nikolai here is in charge of, and we do a lot more training and developing curriculum. And so as we make our services and the data more accessible itself, we're just trying to also have that kind of the brand that matches that. And so kind of to us, it was sort of putting a stake in the ground just to say like, hey, we're switching things up from the build it and they will come kind of mindset, where we just build a bunch of data tools and spend the rest of the year figuring out why no one's using our dashboards, to just being a lot more active with what we're doing and bringing it to people. So like even our business cards with the new logos say, you know, your friendly neighborhood data folks and stuff like that, just trying to be all around more welcoming.
Can you just highlight like one thing that you saw that you're doing that you're like, oh, this is really working out in terms of engagement? I ask because we're doing something not similar, but on that route.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for us, like is maybe our newsletter. So we're trying to make things not just like, here's our 10 favorite spreadsheets or the new administrative data from whatever, but you know, it's called Up to Data. It's more about like 2 paragraphs about maybe how to think about data and how to use it in your nonprofit, you know, in strategic planning or marketing. You know, it's actually just very focused on action and direct translation. And then maybe there's like a section about like some new data, where we just recently did something about the new Blackwell Data Center, right? Just saying that, hey, here's a new resource that's out there. We include a section about like what we're reading and like a podcast or something, just to make it like, it's not, you don't have to consume a bunch of spreadsheets to be good at data or use data, but you know, it's just the way you think about it. And so we're really trying to walk people through the door of data instead of just dropping them in a room of just thousands of indicators.
Thank you so much, presenters, and all your questions.